Hi, Jennifer Benolken with DuPont, here with 4 lovely gentlemen that started 11607 and the testing methods that we all hold dear and near to our hearts at this point. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. I do want to mention that the whole reason why this event is happening today, well, there's 2 different reasons. The first is as an honor to Kurt Larson, who passed away about a year ago. In the losing of his voice and working with customers like we get to work with as MDM specialists within DuPont, I realized that the younger generation, new entrants to industry, were not understanding or didn't know the history of 11607. They follow procedures, but they don't necessarily know why. And these guys are going to be able to tell us why today. And then the second reason is Mike Scholla, Dr. Mike Scholla, down at the end here, who has been with DuPont for 31 years as of September 1st, is going to be retiring at the end of September. And I wanted to get these guys' voices down. So I'm going to have them introduce themselves, and then we will get into the discussion.
From left to right, and from your left to right and our right to left. My name is Hal Miller, and I spent 23 years with Johnson & Johnson 15 years ago. I retired as Director of Packaging Technology for J&J, and have been involved with AMI and ISO and ASTM and all those lovely organizations for many, many years now. So that's my background.
So just to add on a little bit to Hal, Mike didn't know that Hal was going to be here until last night, and so that's why you guys didn't know that he was going to be here either. It's a surprise.
As if anyone cares.
I do.
Hal's the mystery guest. My name's Patrick Nolan. I'm a founder and former owner of DDO. And I've been involved in the ASTM, both with Committee D10 on packaging and Committee F2 for about 25 years of my time in packaging, both before the medical device industry really got involved in a lot of testing, and of course then afterwards. And so I'm glad to be here today, and I hope you can learn something from me. Thanks.
I'm John Spitzley. I worked for 32 years for Medtronic, and I see there's some current and past Medtronic folks here. Before I go any further, though, I would like to kind of propose a toast to the 5th member of the Rat Pack, who unfortunately is not with us today, my partner in consulting, Kurt Larson. So I'd like to offer up a toast to memory of Kurt Larson.
Here, here.
So after I left Medtronic in 2005, Kurt and I had Spartan Design Group, and we did consulting for many companies across America and the world for 15 years. So and I was involved with the original drafting of 11607, and also was active with ASTM Committee F2. Not so much D10, because it was in the capable hands of Mr. Nolan here, but we use the methods all the time.
Hi everybody, Mike Scholla. As Jen said, I'm a short timer. I've got 18 days. I started with DuPont in 1988, and the first project I got was microbial barrier properties of porous packaging materials. And so the first 5 years I was in an internal microbiology consulting group working on Tyvek and a variety of other issues. But in 92, my headcount transferred over to medical packaging, and I've been there ever since. So I've held almost every role in medical packaging, including global business manager. I've been heavily involved in AMI, was on the board of directors for 16 years, chair of the board of directors, serve as chair of the Sterilization Standards Committee, and served on ISO TC 198 WG7 for 26 years, 16 as convener. And that's really the activity where I got to know all these guys.
And you had to wrangle them in here and there.
They didn't take any wrangling. As I was saying in an earlier talk today, the nice part about it is that we all got to know each other's wives. The best trip that we took for ISO was to London. And everybody was there. Everybody had their wife. Everybody was there. Everybody had their wife.
The
And-
wives are in the audience too.
My very favorite thing is we were sitting in the lounge, and Meg Miller came down a few minutes later than Hal did, and she sat down, and the waiter says, "Would you like something, madam?" And she looked at him and said, "Yes, a large Chardonnay." And I don't know. It's like the perfect Meg moment. So anyway, I have a new title at DuPont. I am Emeritus Medical Packaging Fellow. I have a new award. I was elected to the inaugural class, the Amy Fellows. And this past June, I was awarded a Kilmer Award at the 2019 Kilmer Conference. So the Kilmer Award has been given to a total of 18 people over the last 40 years. And so I'm very honored by that. And the night I got the award, I called Hal, I called Spitzley, I called Alan Talentire to thank them for mentoring me from being a bug checker to a box head. So
Here's to box heads and bug checkers.
there you go.
So before,
You come a long way since DuPont Carpets.
so before we go too much further, I do want to thank Blake and crew from LTD Brewing who are hosting us here today. If you're ever in Hopkins, Minnesota, make sure you stop in. I think everyone here would agree the beer is pretty good. Yes. Excellent. All right, you guys. So we have some notes. We'll be referring to them here and there. So I think the first question that comes to mind is, how did you know that 11607 or something of some sort needed to be developed?
Take it away, John.
Well, we had a couple of pre-calls on this, and of course it quickly devolved into telling lots of war stories. So I'll tell you a war story, which kind of, in my mind, captures what, at least the packaging aspect of the medical device industry, what kind of state it was in before ISO 11607. I got a call from the vice president of manufacturing for our Puerto Rican operations, and he said, "Spitzley, get up here." So I said, "Well, what does Uncle Al, the kitty's pal, want today?" So I go up to Al's office, and he's got a thermoform tray, and he throws it on his desk to me, and he says, "I can get this tray for half of what we're paying for it now. Why are we paying so much for the damn tray?" I said, "Al, who gave you the quote?" He said, "Well, we were at a show out on the East Coast somewhere. Might even been a show in Puerto Rico." And he said, "Well, I got a quote from this company that said they can do it for this much." I said, "Well, what did they quote on, Al?" He said, "Well, that tray, you fool. That's what they quoted on that tray." I said, "Al, did you know there's a very vital piece of information that goes along with that tray? It's called a specification. And in that specification, there are certain requirements. Did they get a chance to look at those? Well, no. Why? Well, then I started telling them some of the things like tolerances and cleanliness and thicknesses and so on and so forth and coatings and whatever. He says, why do we need all that stuff? It's just a darn tray. So that's kind of what it was like, especially in the 70s and 80s. A lot of companies looked at the medical device industry and said, there's gold in them there hills. If we can get in the door there, we can make lots of money because they pay a lot more for their stuff. So as a result, along with, lacking in areas of testing and validation, it was pretty much the Wild West, and wiser heads finally decided that something needed to be done in terms of standards and requirements. I'm sure you got something to add to that, Hal.
Not at that particular point in time, but then a funny thing happened. Europe decided to do a whole bunch of standards, and it was called the Medical Device Directive, which basically created a landslide at that point in time.
What year was that? Do you remember?
It had to be like about between 89 or 90, roughly around 1990. First medical device directive came out, somewhere in that particular name. Us old folks get our dementia at this point in time. but the medical device directive happened, and then Europe started creating problems, and then the U.S. decided that the FDA said, well, maybe we ought to look at this too.
Well, I think at that point as well, when Medical Device Directive was created in this European Standards Organization, EN, they started to develop standards to comply with that directive. And so all of those standards were developed, and it was a series of standards, 886. And instead of, there were, how many of those standards, Mike, were
868.
there? 16 of them?
868. Something like that, yeah.
868, yeah.
Yep.
So these standards were all developed by the European Union or by people that did business in Europe only. So the U.S. really had no input into those standards at that time. And so that spurred the U.S. side to really start to look at the input to some of those standards to comply with ISO 11607.
Yeah, and that the result was ISO TC 198 Working Group 7, the U.S. version of that, soon to become chaired by Dr. Scholla.
So, Mike, do you want to share some stories from the beginning of that, or Hal, did you have something to add first?
Well, one thing to add to that particular point in time is that what John didn't mention, but John and Kurt Larson had this, what they call this HEMA, had written a HEMA document at that point in time, which had to do with medical device packaging. Because of that, they were invited to that first TC 198 meeting, which happened in Washington, D.C., probably around 1991 or 2. And they attended the very first WG7 meeting, and they were proposing this whole packaging standards. And then the next meeting and we all joined with Amy, AAMI, they started this Working Group 7, and that was the first meeting that I attended in 1992 along with Mike. I raised my hand to co-chair, and Mike raised his hand to co-chair, and we were off and running.
So, what was the environment then? So you had the SEN working group developing really materials standards just for various materials. Nothing about process validation, so ISO started TC 198, and you have to be part of the EU to be part of the SEN committee, and all the members of the SEN committee were also members of the ISO committee. So nobody could get anything done because the Europeans wanted to be first. the ISO committee wanted to write a broader standard, and ne'er the twain shall meet. And so we finally met in Ottawa, Canada. And we passed a resolution that basically said this: Sen, you go write your standard. ISO, you go write your standard. Quit putting roadblocks in each other's way. And when the standards have to be revised, because they have to be revised every 5 years, we'll see about harmonizing. And the output of that was the publication of ISO 11607 1998. Yeah, six. Somewhere in the middle 90s. I got to kind of remember. I think it was 97. Was it? I don't know. I have it all in my computer.
It is 96 at this point in time. One of the things that happened during that particular, it took us about 4 or 5 years to get this standard. But when you're dealing with an international standard and you're writing things, well, the British like to write things a certain way. They love the word whilst, okay? And then we put our words into it from the U.S., but then the Europeans say, we don't understand that because it won't translate into something we can understand. So the first edition came out with some strange, people thought really strange language. And it all had to do with the fact that it had to be well translatable, like into French and German and whatnot, so they would understand it. So that was a lot of the original wording that was kind of got lost. And people said, particularly the U.S. folks said, we just don't understand this wording.
And there, for those of you who, how many folks out there have read ISO 11607-1 and 2 from cover to cover? Yeah, okay. Anyway, when you do need to look at it and refer to it, pay very close attention to the definitions, because that's what changed the direction for us in London. Because along with, translating English, American English to English to ISO English was kind of problematic. But there was also an issue with what exactly are we talking about? Which level of packaging here? So Mike said, as chair, said we need to have key definitions, and it turned out to be 4 key definitions in the standard: sterile barrier system, protective packaging, packaging system, and I'm going to do Governor of Texas here, preformed sterile barrier system. Those 4 definitions, if you look through the standard, are used extensively throughout the standard, and it makes it clear exactly what part of the packaging system you're talking about. And after that, things kind of opened up and moved a lot more swiftly after that.
So it's taking a step back, because that was the second edition, right? So we've had the first edition out, and there's a whole bunch of requirements in there, but there's test methods that aren't there to support them. How did those get developed?
Well, like any, if you have a standard, well, I know, if you have a standard, and particularly the Medical Device Directive, the Europeans were insistent that if you have a shall requirement, you must be able to comply some way, somehow, through testing or methods. So there must be a method to demonstrate that you comply with this particular requirement. And that's where everything started to come from. So at the end of the first ballot, the first edition, 96, probably the last, I forget which one it was, Mike gets up and says to the group, okay, folks, the next edition, we will only have standardized test methods that have appropriate round-robin testing associated with it. Because the test methods that went into the first edition were They were just, well, you know, dye test. Yeah, we have a dye test. We do it. Yeah, we look at visual inspection. There was other things. There was other strange test methods that were put into that, but they were never demonstrated as sufficient and how much precision there was. So after that, that's when the test method situation took off.
Okay,
If
go
I
ahead.
may, I think just stepping back a half a step there, I think within the first edition, it included some bogus methods, because now that we had the 11607 standard, now we had to have the 11607 standard didn't really tell you how to comply with it. It just told you what the compliance was. Like mostly any law, you don't know. There's many different ways to interpret the law, and then there's regulations that are applied that help you to follow the law. And it's the same with these standards. And in this standard, there are many kind of different bogus methodologies, like, which we can get into, we did in our phone call earlier, microbial challenge testing. But that was used in the very beginning to try to comply with a statement, paraphrasing the standard. The package, you must show that the package remained sterile during transport and distribution. So in other words, you know, the package can't be breached in any way, otherwise it's unsterile. So one of those bogus methods, and Mike and John can speak more to this than myself, but as a testing laboratory, we started to comply with that part of the standard, we started to do microbial challenge testing. We did it as a subcontract with a microbial testing lab, but that was one of the ways early on that we tried to comply with that stipulation of the standard. And then later on, we found, and it documented in some articles that were published in MDDI by Mike and John and Hal and Kurt Larson and other authors, that physical testing was really more sensitive and a better indicator and a better methodology for determining whether a package had maintained its sterility and was intact.
And the method can be validated.
And
John,
the
get your microphone on.
physical methods could actually be validated in some way, whether they were variable or quantitative or qualitative type methods. They could still be validated.
And keep in mind, at that time, when the first standard ISO 11607 was approved, there was not one standardized whole package integrity test available at that point in time.
Yeah, so it was actually kind of an interesting time. You had the whole ISO-SEN thing going on. Bob Reich, when he was at Ethox, published a paper in MDDI on whole package microbial challenge testing, followed by sterility testing. And then Tim Ulatowski at the FDA decided that's what everybody had to do. The test wasn't validatable. And so, again, HEMA, it was the three of us, Lois Jones, Joyce Hanson, Tony Parisi, Ann Baldwin from HEMA. So we went to the FDA. And we sat down with them and explained what the issue was. And we proposed a study where we would make packages with gaps in the seals of various sizes, and we'd run whole package tests on them, and we'd run dye penetration tests on them. And if the dye penetration is more sensitive, we can use it. So we did that. And it's published as part 1 and part 2. The outcome of that was, in fact, a letter from Susan Alpert, who at the time was not at Medtronic. She was the head of CDRH, saying that physical testing is acceptable. And then Tim followed up with a letter that said physical testing was acceptable. That was really a key, that was really important because there wasn't enough places to test all the packages using microbial challenge, right? And it's not a very good test. So the other thing that's important about test methods is after the first edition was published, Hal Miller was, I think, the chair of F2 then. 260. And he put together a list of test methods that didn't exist. And the Sterile Packaging Manufacturers Association, SPMC, which is an association of all the converters, took it upon themselves to develop test methods. And so they developed the test methods and sent them to ASTM for approval by ASTM. So they did a lot of footwork themselves and then sent it to ASTM. And Hal even offered the Europeans to come up with the test methods they want to get validated as ASTM test methods, and the European response never came.
Well, one of the reasons was at the time, ASTM was American Standard of Testing and Materials. It had the name American in front of it. And at that particular time, the Europeans said, no, it has American in it, we don't want anything to do with it. When they finally changed it to ASTM, they get rid of the American, it became a little bit easier. But at that time, right after the first edition, talking about the ASTM, the first thing we decided to do, okay, what is the most popular whole package test that people do at the time? Think about it. I bet you still do it today. Visual inspection. That was the first one we did. And then what's the second most important test you had to do? Simple. Dye penetration. And they were the first two tests we ended up doing. And they got basically published in 1998, right after that. And then a whole slew just took off after that. Pat was involved, and all of us, as far as bringing all these particular methods. So by the time the second edition came out, part 1 and 2, we had standardized test methods to do with it. The only ones we had, it's worth saying, when first edition started out, we had D4169, package distribution testing, as a standard method. We had burst testing, what was it, F1140 I think it was, and we had F88, seal strength. Those are the only standardized tests that were there. And right now, I think we cover everything.
So SPMC contributed, I believe, a bubble immersion test, which started out rather crude in its own right, and through the years has been established pretty well as a fairly validatable test, but still a good one for some packages. And there are, as I recall, many different variations even on how to perform that test, particularly with porous packaging like Tyvek. And we came up with methodologies to coat the Tyvek so that we could get pressure inside the pouch or the tray. Many different types of ways to coat it, either with varnish or with some foam material, not foam in that sense of the word, but like a soapy foam. Just things like that would allow us to get the pressure in the package to determine if there was a leak through a seal or through the other substrate besides Tyvek, if it was plastic film or what have you. So through the years, these ASTM methods that were rather crude really before the medical device industry got a hold of them, so to speak, and started to work with them and refine them and make them better. These standards are now, they're still being revised and updated and improved, but now we have a pretty good group of validatable and validated standards to help us comply with the 1106 requirements.
But back when, stepping back a little bit, when Tim Ulatowski and the FDA was mandating that MDMs do a microbial challenge test because it was, you know, basically the most widely known test for integrity. Medtronic was having a particularly hard time getting packages through that test method and was kind of blocking up the product development cycle. So I did a sneaky thing, which was not surprising to a lot of people. I put some packages together and put some known defects in them and tested some of them with, at that time, it was a rather crude dye penetration test, the old methylene blue method. And then I sent a set of 30 each to 2 different microbial labs. And of course, I picked up most of the defects pretty readily, even with that crude dye test method. And both of the labs passed them with flying colors. So I published that in an article. And the timing was great because it was about the time that things were kind of lining up to go talk to the FDA. And so it was, as Jackie Gleason used to say in his the show The Honeymooners, when that article got published and we wanted to talk to him about physical methods, it was kind of hamna. So that kind of broke the ice with them, and then that led to that 2-part article that Mike referred to. And
Then didn't John, FDA issue actually an official letter from the FDA to say officially that physical testing could be used instead of or in lieu of this microbial challenge testing?
as long as they could be validated, which we knew they could be. Unfortunately, their preferred method could not be validated. It was a strange letter.
So the moral of the story is physical tests over microbial challenge test any day of the week.
Yep.
Excellent. Okay, moving on to the next topic. We are moving into 2 parts now. So we have part 1 and part 2. Why do we need 2 parts?
So, as I said, the goal was to harmonize 11607 and EN 868 Part 1. And so actually there's a version of 11607 that most of you didn't buy, but it published. And what we did in that version was right after 11607, the first edition was published, we revised it. And what we did was we put in a whole bunch of notes. And the notes all said, if compliance to EN 868 Part 1 is also what you want to do, there are additional requirements in clause 5.2.3, okay? And the whole intent of all those notes was to show that the 2 standards were very close already, okay? And so in the ISO process, you go through developing drafts, and when it gets to the DIS stage, it goes to ISO Central Secretariat in Geneva, and they take over. And so we were now at the FDIS stage, and a new editor had come in. And this new editor had eliminated all the notes from the document because they were referring to a SEN standard. Talk about piss and matches, ISO and SEN, it's all the time, right? And so I got really ticked. And so I got on a plane and went to Geneva, and I sat down and had lunch with the editor and the program manager, and I said, look, here's what's going to happen. The ballot is out. I'm going to contact everybody that I know on this committee and tell them to vote no. And if you don't, then reissue a ballot with all the notes put back in, I will recommend that we stop work and let the EN 868-1 take effect. Guess what happened? Unanimous negative. They put all the notes back. Unanimous positive. So when it came time to really harmonize, the issue we had was that EN 868 Part 1 had nothing in it about process validation.
Or package testing.
Yeah, package testing really. Just material testing. And we were worried that if we put the validation part into ISO 11607, that the Europeans would vote negatively because it had the validation part in there. So we made a conscious decision to split it into two parts, because that way you could harmonize part one. Both organizations vote in favor, but if SEN rejected part two, ISO would still accept it, and so we get 90% of the way there. Now, today, my recommendation to WG7 is when I stepped down as convener last December, was there's no need for two parts anymore. Just take the validation part and incorporate it into part one. Just a new section. So that's why we did it. It worked. Because you also have to understand that at that time, and even to this day, Europe and the US have very different opinions on what validation is. Right? Yeah. Oh, yeah. And so that was another kind of potential gaping hole in the road. So
The other thing too was, if you look at the European delegation, for most of it, there was only one medical device manufacturer that sat on the European side. They were from Beiersdorf. And the Beiersdorf people thought validation, process validation should be there. And they were the only ones in the entire European delegation. We on the US side, we all knew about it and said, yeah, it has to be there. So that's why the Europeans, particularly the sterile packaging manufacturers, they didn't want anything to do with it, particularly since now suppliers also had to look at process validation.
The other thing that was unique about Europe, it's probably more common here now with hospital consolidation, was back in the 90s when the standard was being developed. There were most of the medical device packaging was being done by hospitals. They would buy the devices and then package them and sterilize them themselves. They were not prepared to comply with a lot of the requirements that were being put down in the ISO standard. So we had to keep that in mind and give them alternatives that would still allow them to comply with the standard, because we put the question to them, if you were a patient in a European hospital, would you want the hospital to put packaging around their devices before they used them on you and not test the materials or validate the process? And obviously the answer is no. So that they allowed us to continue forward with putting those requirements in. The same requirements applied to the hospitals.
I just got something on my mind about just the overall trend in industry overall, not only in the medical device industry, but actually in hazardous material packaging and up to this point into the early 90s, middle 90s, all the specification regulations, as Mike mentioned, it was all materials, 886. And all those regulations pertain to how you design the package, what the materials have to be in the package. And the trend, not only in med device industry, was for that kind of system, but it changed during that time where we were looking at performance, the performance of the package. It doesn't matter what the material is or how you construct it or what have you. It was, will it perform to the purpose that it was designed for? So what that meant was then there was a huge need for performance tests, for methodologies, validated methodologies that could measure how the package was performing, how well you put a seal on a medical device, in terms of hazardous material packaging, and the same thing happened at that time frame as well, where would a package filled with chemicals burst open when you dropped it? You know, it didn't matter what the material was, but if it broke open when you dropped it from a certain height, did it break? That's a performance test. So we got into this performance evaluation rather than does it meet a material specification. And that's an important point, I think, to make, particularly in ISO 11607 as we move forward. Now we're looking at using ASTM D4169, and that's nothing but a performance test. It's a physical test to evaluate the protective capability of that package, whether it's a medical device or what have you. And so this is, I think, an important thing to remember at this time is not until then did we really get into this idea of using performance evaluation rather than just does it meet a material spec.
Thanks, Pat. That's a very good point. But it's also a good segue into another conversation. Performance and stability, why don't we do them in series as opposed to parallel?
If I could, I got some ideas on that one. When we first, as I said earlier, laws are made for interpretation. So are standards, or so are the MDD, or Medical Device Directive. Many of the standards and regulations, they can be interpreted different ways. And as I recall, back in the middle 70s when I first came across 11607 as a tester at DDL, I looked at that standard in one particular way. How can people comply with it? And I used the tools at my disposal to take this performance evaluation and idea and try to develop protocols that a medical device manufacturer could use to comply with that standard. And so I had one interpretation of how that could be done. I wrote protocols. As a company, we put those protocols out to try to provide services for medical device manufacturers. And lo and behold, we started a business based on that with SciMed and some of the early companies around town. And so that was one interpretation of the standard. At that time, Bob Reich again published an article which mirrored, our protocols mirrored basically what he had said in the article. And that was an MDDI article probably back in about 1998 time frame as well. And in that article, he put together a sequence of events, a proposed sequence of events to test packaging. And in that sequence, he actually put in accelerated aging and then distribution simulation testing. And so we went with that. That was the best practice of the day, or that was early on what someone's interpretation of the best performance test was for medical device packaging. And you'll hear in a minute why perhaps that wasn't maybe the best way to do it, but that was our interpretation. And that was an early interpretation of how to comply with the standard.
When that standard was written, we kind of took pains, at least Kurt and I and Hal, that we should make the user aware of the fact that if you were going to combine accelerated aging and performance testing, that you're going to be stressing your packaging systems more than likely way beyond what they would see in a real world environment. And a lot of companies experienced that. They had failures on package systems that they tested when they combined the two regimens on products that they had had out in the field for years and years with no failures. So when we wrote, I think the first version or the second version, we wrote, specifically put in notes, try to pointing out that they are two separate entities. We didn't say you couldn't do it, and that's kind of where some people got the direction to combine them. Lots of times just to save time and money, but we made notes in the standard and in the guidance document that you're kind of treading on thin ice when you do that, because you're going to risk failure when really you probably had a good packaging system. I think by and large now people, how about you guys out there? Are you separating aging from performance testing? Good. Where's those gold stars that you had?
I gave them all to you guys last night.
Okay.
I always took the approach that I was on the other end, and the fact that if your materials don't degrade, aging over time, and your seals don't degrade over time, then the package doesn't degrade over time. So you put the two together, because as John says, some of these times you're putting a lot of emphasis on a package that it will probably never see. So this went back and forth, and that's why the standard took a while to get developed, and it also changed several times. Pat and I went at it at this point in
I
time.
have to give Pat credit for having an open mind.
Hey,
Yeah.
say that into the mic.
You had we did have some disagreements, but you were responsible for ASTM F1980, and that's where they're separated.
Spitz, I think he wanted to hear you say that.
Thank
he
you
had
for an open
Yeah,
mind.
yeah,
yes.
I wanted to say on
So-
the mic that you were giving me credit.
So,
You didn't hear that.
so it's amazing how fast an hour
I
goes. We
did,
have
but
about
they did.
12 minutes left. Shola, you wanted to say something. I want to make sure that we've covered the key ingredients of today's talk that you guys brought up during our pre-discussions, and then also open it up to the floor. So Shola?
So the only thing I was going to say is having a conversation with one of the notified bodies in Europe, and this topic of separating accelerated aging from performance testing. And they said, we agree with the whole theory of it. We're fine with it. But you would not believe how many companies do not do a seal strength determination at time zero pre and post sterilization. And so now they've got data on seal strength after 5 years of aging, but they don't have data on what time zero was. Okay? And then we don't accept it because you haven't demonstrated that your seals aren't degrading. So if you do it, don't forget to run your control. Okay?
Just quickly on that same vein, I can't remember how many times someone would ask us, well, if we do 4169, do we have to do any testing of the packaging afterwards? Well, yes, of course, because you're doing 4169 on a transport package, on a box filled with sterile barrier systems. And you have to determine whether or not that dynamic testing actually caused any problems to the sterile barrier system. So you have to run an integrity test on the package. So this guidance document, TIR 22, is it?
Yeah, I think it was.
22, yeah.
No, 16,
So
774.
that guidance document was important for people who are just getting into this industry, just like they were in a different job and then they were thrust into packaging and now they don't know anything. This TIR gave them some guidance even on things like that. Yes, you have to run testing after 4169 testing.
The other slippery slope that Kurt and I would consistently encounter when we would talk to people we were consulting with, would ask them about performance testing that they'd done, and we said, well, what was your sample size? Well, we had 3 boxes with 50 sterile barrier systems and 50 devices, so we had a sample size of 150. Wrong. You had a sample size of 3. Let me tell you, they didn't want to hear that. I'm not going to ask you guys if you do the same thing. That's embarrassing.
That's a good idea.
Just to wrap it up from the ISO standpoint, once we had the ISO documents, the last one, people said, well, how do we comply? They want a cookbook. I want to do step 1, step 2, give me a cookbook how to do this. Well, then we decided in AMI that we wanted a technical information report, basically a guidance document. That guidance document gave a lot of how-tos, what you should do, what you can do, what you shouldn't do. What happened from that is very interesting because you heard about European hospitals. U.S. hospitals didn't have any process validation stuff either. So also out of that guidance document, Amy also did something for hospitals, how to validate their systems. The other thing in the 11607, which nobody probably likes, is sterilization containers. They got sterilization containers in 11607. So Amy again did a guidance document on how to validate your sterilization containers. So things just trickled down from 11607 to cover as many different things and guidelines as they could.
All right, so going through the list of the hot topics, we talked about lengthy vocabulary, terminology conversations. One thing we didn't touch on, and I'll come back to at the end here because I think that you guys will jump on it. I'll mention in a second. Contentious whole package integrity testing, we talked about that. Battle in trying to separate stability from performance, we discussed that. And we kind of touched on the concept of suppliers getting involved after the 2-part document came out with having new requirements for them. And they were kind of woken up at that point where someone had written requirements for them and they hadn't played a role in what those requirements were. The last thing that you guys wanted to talk about, which I know that everyone in the audience and online are on bated breath about, is the 1 pound minimum. Hal, you want to take that one?
Listen to the chuckles out there.
No one can figure, I think,
How
even on
many
this
still
panel.
use a 1 pound minimum as their minimum requirement for seal strength? Lots of gold stars out there, John, I'll tell you. It's interesting. How did it get started? My recollection,
Nobody knows.
my recollection is it goes back to paper manufacturers, a predecessor to, Bemis at this point in time. They developed a heat seal coating on coated Tyvek. And they said, we will guarantee you that you'll get 1 pound minimum seal strength.
Coated paper. Not coated Tyvek.
Coated paper,
Yeah, you said Tyvek.
whatever the coating was. Okay. Was that before Tyvek?
Coated paper.
You mean that was before Tyvek? Oh my gosh, something before Tyvek. Anyway, it's been a contentious situation between the two of us, paper versus Tyvek. Anyway, it was their 1 pound guarantee, and everybody said, okay, then we'll have a 1 pound minimum.
Well, Kurt did a little research and actually published a historical article on that, and it was exactly that. There was a problem with paper. If you got much over 1 pound, it would shred and tear and kick out fibers. So that was actually originally, according to Kurt, and who am I to disagree with Kurt, that it was actually a maximum rather than a minimum, but it morphed into a maximum. a minimum. And looks like we're still living with it today.
Yeah, we're also not going to talk about how small of a hole is okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That goes along with the 1 pound minimum and how small of a hole should we be able to detect. And the difficulty with standardization and putting in numbers for like specifications for performance is that you can have a package that has a 1/4 pound of seal strength perform just as well as a package with 1 pound. So we get back to this idea of performance qualification rather than material spec or putting in a number that a test method has to produce a certain number for it to be acceptable. Well, that's difficult, particularly in this environment of performance rather than material qualification.
Excellent. So we have 5 minutes left. Does anyone in the audience have a question? Did they answer them all? Yes.
Seal width.
Seal width. Ah.
It's mentioned once in ISO 11607, right after it talks about seal strength testing in the performance section. What is the original intent for evaluating seal width?
So the question is, what is the original intent of mentioning seal width inside 11607, and it's only mentioned one time? Anyone want to take that?
Yeah, you have to have seal width. Again, it's the same thing, that a seal that's 1 micron wide when it starts, I mean, that's kind of ludicrous, but if it's 1 micron wide or 1 millimeter wide when it starts, and it's still 1 millimeter wide after performance testing, then it was good enough.
Just to show that you were mentioning performance testing is really like kind of the meat and potatoes other than the material performance perspective. But so when you go through your performance testing, and let's say, I'm just wondering, is the seal width measurement and evaluation creep? What creep might be on the system?
No.
Yeah,
Impact.
if the seal creeps from 3/8 of an inch to 1/8 of an inch, but it's still intact, then you're good. Then you still have a package with sterile integrity.
Provided.
You may want to determine why you're getting creep.
Here's a proviso. Have you demonstrated that your seal width minimum seal width will go through your performance testing? That's it. If your minimum seal width goes through performance testing and sterilization, that's it. So you can have impact a lot of heavy items. You get some seal separation, seal creep through sterilization and the other things. So you do need to have a minimum, but you need to demonstrate that it's acceptable.
Or you have pressure differential that causes the seals to creep, particularly in a non-porous package. But
So you're talking about this last version, the one that just published, right?
Not even just the last one. It's been there since the 2006 version.
Yeah. So the biggest, I think we changed a little bit in the 2019 version because scope creep, EN 868 Part 5, which is pouches for use in hospitals, specifies a minimum seal width, and notified bodies have tried to impose that on medical device manufacturers. And I think it's 5 millimeters, 5 or
It was 6 millimeters, and you talk about the theory and the standard. That's why I was wondering, because we were saying that there was like this battle over a non-standard source. Does that seal width have some sort of correlation with those?
No,
They're
No.
prescriptive,
No.
the EN standards.
yeah, they're very prescriptive, and they're based upon, okay, what do we make?
I think the biggest issue that I see is even with notified bodies is they're used to seeing something in a particular way. Whether it's right or wrong, it has really no bearing on it. But working with a customer and getting their validation set up, this specific auditor likes to see things done in a specific way. Jack's talking a little bit about the seal width, etc. Hal's talking about all you gotta do is spec out a minimum while they want to see it fully measured, right? So you take a paradigm shift of going go all the way to the left or going all the way to the right. The way that the auditor wants to see it is the way the auditor wants to see it. Now organizations are at the point where they're throwing everything at the wall to make it stick because they don't want to have the auditor come back and ask any questions at all because time to market is extremely sensitive and costly. As you guys have laid a fantastic foundation, that's still happening today. Everything is being thrown at the wall, hopefully something sticks so they don't have to deal with A, the FDA, and B, the CE mark. Any questions being brought up? Because they don't have the technical bandwidth behind them to go argue it.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that quite a bit still.
Well, I think they're still operating in cookbook. So therefore, this is what I have to do, and you don't really look into it and think about how do I really prove this. They're just, exactly, they're doing exactly what the auditor wants, so they can get the market and get the CE mark, or get the, whatever it might be. Not a lot of challenging out there these days, I don't think.
The performance testing from the stability, that's another big bone of contention even still today. It's ironic, but it still happens every single day. Even with the number of consultants that are out there, they like to see things done in a specific way. So they're guiding customers to do it in a specific way. Whether it's the right way or the wrong way, it's neither here nor there because you can still satisfy the requirements. But mark my words is when they have a problem, you gotta go backwards.
You can teach kids to read, but then sometimes they turn around and eat the books, you know?
I hear you.
All right.
So Jen,
Yep,
just
Scholla.
one quick question.
Yep.
Would you like me to mention what's going on in terms of the MDR?
I do, but hold on one second.
Okay.
So we're at 3:02, so people that are live streaming, please feel free to stay on if you want to. We'll keep it on for a few more minutes. Scholla's going to talk a little bit about what's going on with MDR for a second, and then we'll probably have Leslie come up and say a couple of words, and then we'll be on to socializing and networking a little bit more. I do also want to thank both DDL and QTS for being co-sponsors with us. So thank you, DDL, QTS. Nice work.
Okay, so, we've given plenty of talks about MDD versus MDR, and what fundamentally in the end is you end up with a consultant, and so a SEN consultant, okay? So the SEN consultant and the attorney from the European Union made this decision about 4 or 5 months ago that ISO 11607 should never have been harmonized to the MDD. Okay? Because if you go back and look at the call for standards, it's not specifically listed in that document. Neither is gamma radiation and a whole variety of different things. But so the decision is the MDD is going to be around for another 12 months, right? Against the MDD? No, because the notified bodies have to use the latest and greatest standards anyway. The second thing is that MDD consultant is not a packaging guy. The Haas consultant is a risk assessment guy. And he's requesting some additional reinforcement of ISO 11607 regarding risk assessment. And if you need more information on the status of this, et cetera, I think we have something posted on our website, but otherwise just call Terry.
Says the retiring guy.
Or your local DuPont representative.
There you go. Sure.
Hey, Mike, can I borrow your mic?
Yeah. Hey, everybody. I'm Leslie Love from DuPont. Thank you all for coming today. I would be remiss in recognizing Jen Benolken for the great work she did to put the event together. So if we can have a hand for Jen. And of course, the many contributions of the team up here. Thanks again to QTS and DDL for also helping to support this. Before we close out today and invite you to stay and socialize, I would be also want to take the opportunity to recognize from our team that works at DuPont the many contributions that Mike has shared with our overall business. He's had a lot of industry recognition for the work that he's done, but as a team member and such a critical part of the DuPont family in medical packaging, we thank him and we want to recognize him today. We have a little clock here one of Mike's favorite sayings, thanks Jen for digging this out. Mike is, and the moral of the story is, so thank you.
Thank you very much. All I got to say is it's been a good run. Have a few beers. Enjoy.
Thanks everyone for coming in. They'll be around for questions.